My name is Roberta Boggess, but first of all, I don't like Roberta. I was named after my grandmother, and her other name was Ola. So given the choice, I think I dodged a bullet there. But my father always said that I would not be Roberta, I would have to be Bob. And actually, I was Bob to my father. And so when he would introduce his kids, he would say, "These are my kids, Bob, Bill, and George," and you had to figure out which one was which. My last name is Boggess, but it is most commonly mispronounced Boggess. And for years, I was the English department chair at my school, at my high school. And when I retired, I said that they should name it after me, and that way the kids could refer to it as that Boggess English department. Now, what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is Christmas customs. We all know that when we celebrate Christmas, what we are really celebrating is a whole melange of things that are some Christian, some pagan, etc., and some are just apocryphal. So we'll start out with one of those apocryphal things. When exactly was Jesus born? Well, when you were a little kid and you were growing up, if you were thinking about Jesus and not just Santa Claus, you thought that Jesus was born in December. And that was the reason that we celebrated his birth then. But actually, historians say it's more likely that he was born either in the spring or the fall. And the reason is that the Roman Empire would do census taking at this time. Now, depending on which historians you listen to, you may or may not agree when Jesus was born, because there was no major Roman census that occurred in the year he was born. But at the same time, realize that the Roman Empire was so large and so extended, and it was so difficult to communicate to the far reaches of the empire, that very often people who were local governors, it was left up to their discretion how they did things. And a census might take 2 or 3 years. Now, why in the spring or in the fall? Because if you're in the Middle East and you're going to travel, you want to travel when it's not raining and the roads are going to be dry. And the other thing is, you want to travel when it's not going to impede growing your crops. So you could travel early in the spring before spring planting, or late in the fall when you had brought your crops in. So in that case, why is it we celebrate Jesus' birthday in December? Well, as you all know, when the Christians first started out, they were very much a persecuted religion. If you advertise the fact that you were Christian, you very often put a death sentence on top of yourself. You all know that we have the symbol that you see on the backs of cars of the fish. And that was an early symbol of Christianity. If you were a hidden Christian, you'd be standing there talking to your neighbor, and perhaps you suspected that he was a Christian as well. What you would do, and we've all done that when we stand in front of somebody and you shift your weight from foot to foot and hip to hip, you would take your foot and you would draw half of a fish. If the person were not a Christian, he'd just think you were doodling around with your sandaled foot. But if he was also a hidden Christian, he would complete the fish, and this was a way of knowing that you belonged to the same religion without advertising it, because crucifixion was a very common way of dealing with miscreants in the Roman Empire. It wasn't just Jesus who was crucified. Many, many people were. And if you advertised your religion, that was something that was likely to happen to you. And so, in the wintertime, in December, as the days grow shorter, not obviously shorter in hours, but in daylight, what happened was, if you were Roman, imagine, you don't wear underwear, you wear a toga, you wear a blanket wrapped around you. It's probably very, very cold as those winter winds whoosh up underneath your toga. And what you would like to see is spring come, because you know that the days are going to become longer and warmer. So you celebrate in December that you have finally reached the day of the least amount of sunlight. And in order to do this, you had basically a drunken orgy for several days. You were very, very fixated on your celebration. And so you weren't noticing if anybody else happened to be celebrated, and this was called the Saturnalia. And during this time you would celebrate, and so if you were a Christian, you could celebrate Jesus' birthday at the same time, and you wouldn't be crucified for it, because all of your neighbors who were non-Christian were drunk out of their minds and they weren't paying attention to this. By the time Christianity became the accepted religion of Rome, it was very established that what happened is you celebrated the birth of Jesus December 24th, December 25th, and it stayed. And so we have what is called Christmas, which is actually Christ's Mass, and this is where the term comes about. Now, one of the things that we associate with Christmas is that we know that the wise men came to bring gifts to the Christ child. And again, when you were a small child, especially if you had a nativity scene in your family, you probably thought that these gifts, especially the gold, was a great big chest of gold coins. And perhaps what you thought is that when the family fled to Egypt, they needed money for the motel, etc. And so the wise men had brought this gold with them. But actually, the story behind this is, you have to understand that all of this trading was going on in the Mediterranean. And after you would unload your ship, maybe you were from Greece and you unloaded your ship in Egypt, you'd go to the local bar. And all these guys would sit around at night, the sailors, and they would talk, and they'd talk about stories, customs, etc. from their countries. And what began to happen is things began to happen. Now we know in Egypt, where they went through a very elaborate kind of ceremony to process bodies, to produce a mummy. And so some of that began to emerge into the customs that you found along the Middle East. One of was, you would wrap people in strips of cloth. And what you tucked inside those strips of cloth was frankincense and myrrh, which is sap from trees that you found in what is today Saudi Arabia. They are bug repellent. And so what it would do was keep all of these little critters from munching on the body that was dead. So when mummies were very, very processed, one of the things that were tucked into them was this frankincense and myrrh. Now, go to Greek culture. For the Greeks, they believed that when a person died, you had to cross a river called the River Styx. And in order to cross this, you had to pay the boatman. And he demanded 2 gold coins. So when bodies were laid out in state, coins would be placed over the eyes. Now eventually it degenerates into pennies for a dead man's eyes. But originally it was gold coins. If you reached the shore and the boatman could not be paid, you would be condemned to be a ghost, to wander up and down the shore for the rest of eternity. So these gold coins were very, very important. When you have Jesus being buried, you have these 2 customs melding. So when the wise men came, the wise men were actually men who were of a priestly class, probably from the area of Iraq and Iran. We now know that they were probably people who had the equivalent of like a physics and chemistry education for the average high school student today. And what they would wear was very voluminous robes that had a lot of pockets in them. And when they appeared to people, you would have a chemical here and a chemical here. And when you wanted to dazzle people, you took the 2 chemicals, you rubbed them together, and poof, there was purple smoke. And you stepped by the next convenient tree. And of course, everybody was mesmerized by the purple smoke and didn't notice that you were behind the tree. And they went, oh my gosh, it's magic. And magic comes from the name of this priestly class. These were the Magi. So they were people who knew something about how the physical world worked in an age where most people believed that the things that happened on the earth happened because of supernatural entities. When these people came to visit the Christ child, supposedly part of what they knew about was prophecy. And they were able to prophesy that this was the Son of God, where he was going to be born, and what ultimately was going to be his destination, his destiny. And so when they brought gifts to him, they did not bring him a large chest of gold. What they brought was the 2 pieces of gold that would be placed on his eyes after he'd been crucified. Now, we very much associate Christmas with this, but there are other symbols that we have for Christmas, and probably the most predominant one is Santa Claus. And Santa Claus actually started as a real individual. After the Catholic Church became accepted in Europe, and it spread throughout Europe, you had many people who eventually were considered saints by the Catholic Church. One of these was a man who was a bishop who lived in Turkey during the 4th century, and his name was Nicholas. Nicholas was noted for the fact that he was an extremely wealthy man, came from a very connected family, and gave up this wealth in order to go into the Catholic Church and to be a man of goodness and a man dedicated to self-poverty. Now at that time, if you wanted to marry as a young woman, you needed a dowry. It didn't matter if you were the most beautiful woman in town. Most marriages were not for the sake of love. They were business deals. You were either going to consolidate property or increase your wealth. And so a beautiful girl without a dowry would be left unmarried, and the ugliest girl in town, if she had a wealthy father, would have a lot of suitors. And so as the story goes, and it may be apocryphal, there were 3 beautiful daughters, and they could not marry because their father was very poor. He didn't have a dowry even for one, much less all 3 of them. People didn't have much clothing at that time. You usually had the one outfit that you wore and perhaps a blanket to wrap around yourself. And so when you wanted to clean your clothing, you would strip down, you'd wrap the blanket around yourself, and you would clean your clothing. And what they used to do is lay the clothing out on racks over the ashes in the fireplace so that it would dry by morning and you could put the clothing on. Stockings were particularly difficult because they were very long and very thick. And so what you had was a device that was basically a circle. You put it in the top of the stocking, you spread the stocking apart, and you had a little hook on this ring, and you hung it up inside the chimney. And all of the heat rising up the chimney would dry the stockings. Now supposedly Nicholas had heard about these girls and their problem. So in the dead of night, he snuck across the roof of their house and he dropped 3 bags of gold down the chimney. And because it's a wonderful legend, he also had great aim. And the bags of gold, each one went inside of a stocking. And when they awoke the next morning, lo and behold, here was their dowry and they could marry. And this is where we get the custom of putting Christmas presents or putting money or fruit or whatever into the stocking. Now, as the Catholic religion spread across all of Europe, these kinds of customs went with it. And filling stockings was very, very common. Now we get to Holland. When you get to Holland, St. Nicholas' name becomes corrupted, and he is known as Sinterklaas. When the Dutch immigrate to the New World, to New Amsterdam, they bring Sinterklaas with him. But he doesn't look the way we expect Santa Claus to look today. He looks like a well-to-do Dutch burgher. He wears brown clothing, he has a pipe, and on Christmas Day what he does is he goes from house to house and he carries a bag with him. And he's already been apprised by the parents of whether or not the children have been good. If they have been good, he will give them a present. But if these are children, and this was social control in New Amsterdam, if these were children that the parents were worried about their behavior, you could bring the whole community down by the message that Sinterklaas left them. And what he would pull out of his bag was pieces of coal, because coal was totally worthless. People were heating their house with coal. And he brought out switches cut from the bush next to their parents' front door. And he laid these switches on quite liberally if the child did not behave. So it was the community exercising control on the behavior of these children. Now, Sinterklaas becomes very, very popular. But the English come in and New Amsterdam becomes New York. They cannot understand Sinterklaas and it becomes corrupted to Santa Claus. Now probably it wouldn't have gone any further than that, except along comes a man in 1823 whose name is Clement Moore. He was a religious teacher. He was a great scholar of ancient Hebrew. He was a very learned man and very respected in his time for the books that he produced. But one Christmas, he wrote a little poem for his children, and it's called A Visit from St. Nicholas, and he gave it to them as a Christmas present. His family urged him to have it published, and he did not want it published because he felt that it was frivolous. and that people would no longer take his scholarly pursuits seriously. After he died, his children had it published. And the irony to this is no one remembers him for any of his scholarly works, but he is remembered very much for all of the icons that he added to the Santa Claus image. So I'm going to read this to you, and then we're going to point out some of these. "'Twas the night before Christmas when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there. The children were nestled all snug in their beds while visions of sugar plums danced in their heads. And Mama in her kerchief and I in my cap had just settled our brains for a long winter's nap. When out on the lawn there arose such a clatter, I sprang from the bed to see what was the matter. Away to the window I flew like a flash, tore open the shutters, threw up the sash. The moon on the breast of the new fallen snow gave the luster of midday to objects below, when what to my wondering eyes should appear but a miniature sleigh of 8 tiny reindeer. With a little old driver so lively and quick, I knew in a moment it must be St. Nick. More rapid than eagles his coursers they came, and he whistled and shouted and called them by name. Now Dasher, now Dancer, now Prancer and Vixen, on Comet, on Cupid, on Dunder and Blitzen, to the top of the porch, to the top of the wall. Now dash away all. As dry leaves that before the wild hurricane fly, when they meet with an obstacle, mount to the sky. So up to the housetop the coursers they flew, with a sleigh full of toys, and St. Nicholas too. And then in a twinkling I heard on the roof the prancing and pawing of each little hoof. As I drew in my head and was turning around, down the chimney St. Nicholas came with a bound. He was dressed all in fur from his head to his foot, and his clothes were all tarnished with ashes and soot. A bundle of toys he had flung on his back, and he looked like a peddler just opening his pack. His eyes, how they twinkled, his dimples, how merry, his cheeks were like roses, his nose like a cherry. His droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow, and the beard on his chin was as white as the snow. The stump of a pipe he held tight in his teeth, and the smoke had encircled his head like a wreath. He had a broad face and a little round belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. He was chubby and plump, a right jolly old elf, and I laughed when I saw him in spite of myself. A wink of his eye, a twist of his head, soon gave me to know I had nothing to dread. He spoke not a word, but went straight to his work, and filled all the stockings, then turned with a jerk. And laying his finger aside of his nose, and giving a nod, up the chimney he rose. He sprang to his sleigh, to his team gave a whistle, and away they all flew like the down of a thistle. But I heard him exclaim ere he drove out of sight, "Happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night." Now all of a sudden, Santa Claus has reindeer, he has a sleigh, he comes down the chimney. If you've ever wondered what sugar plums are, long before there were the types of candy that we know about today, people used to dry fruit and roll it in honey and sugar, and that was your sweets. Mama's in her kerchief and I in my cap because nobody has insulation in their homes. And so it's very, very cold at night and the heat seeps out of your head, so you have to keep that warmth in. Now, you notice at this point he also smokes, which is something that we have gotten away from. But he's not dressed in red, and we don't have the white fur. So where this comes about is along comes a man whose name is Thomas Nast. Thomas Nast is a political cartoonist. And even if you have never heard the man's name, you are very familiar with him because he is the one who created the donkey for the Democratic Party and the elephant for the Republican Party. He worked for Harper's Weekly, which was a very popular magazine at this time, and when this was printed, he was the person who was asked to illustrate Santa Claus. And he is the one who came up with the red velvet suit, the white, the black boots, all of this. Now, how does this become an icon that goes all around the world? Coca-Cola picks him up, and he becomes the American symbol of Christmas. Now, we also have a ninth reindeer. who is Rudolph. After World War II, remember Gene Autry, the singing cowboy? I mean, kids now would find it very difficult to believe that a singing cowboy could be that popular. But anything that Gene Autry recorded would go gold almost instantly. So a young, unknown songwriter came to him with a little ditty called Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. He recorded it. It went gold. And the next year, the same songwriter came back with another little ditty, Frosty the Snowman, which also went gold. And of course, this, after World War II, is the beginning of the infancy of television. And we are looking for things to entertain children. So if you've ever seen the Rudolph with the little claymation, which I'm sure you saw when you were a child, and they're still showing it to your grandchildren, this is what popularized all this. Now we're just going to talk about a couple other things, and that, for instance, is Christmas trees. Christmas trees are an extremely ancient pagan symbol, and they were revered by pagans because they are evergreen, which means in the winter when everything else died, this tree must have tremendous power because it could stay green through the coldest winter. The Catholic Church was very savvy. When they moved into areas, they realized that if they wanted to convert people, and they told people that everything that they had ever believed was stupid, and they therefore were stupid, they would not be able to successfully convert people. So what they did is they adopted many of the pagan symbols and brought them into the church. We can see that a great deal in New Mexico when Catholicism went into the pueblos. And so the Catholic Church at Christmas time would decorate with evergreen boughs and trees to indicate that Christ was everlasting. When Martin Luther King broke with the Catholic Church and created his own church, the Lutheran Church, he wanted people still to have this image of Christ's everlasting life. And so what he would do is he is the first person to bring Christmas trees into his home. Did I just say Martin Luther King? My apologies. Martin Luther. So I'm Martin Luther's wife was a former nun. And so when they had children, they brought the Christmas tree into the house. And if you've ever seen a naked Christmas tree sitting there in the corner of the living room, it's just begging to be decorated. And so they looked around them and they used everything that was typically German. They put pickles and nuts and little Christmas cookies, German Christmas cookies on the tree. Germany is an area of tremendous glass blowing. And so they found that if you put all these edibles on the tree, you also had mice on the tree. And so now what they did is they would recreate them in glass and hang them up there. Now, how does this get to the United States? One of the largest immigrant groups ever to come to the United States were German immigrants. And when they came here, not only did they settle in the East, but they spread into what we now call the Midwest, which at that time we thought was Western as far as you could go, and then farther and farther out to the West. They valued education tremendously because they wanted to be able to read the Bible. And so both boys and girls were taught, and very often in the small schoolhouses in these little rural towns, your school teacher was a young, unmarried German girl. At Christmas time, she wanted the kids to enjoy the customs that she had, so she'd go out in the woods and get a little Christmas tree, bring it into the school, and they would all decorate it with paper ornaments, etc., and it looked pretty, and so the kids would go home and tell their parents about this. Now, the way in which Christmas trees entered England is when Victoria married Albert. Albert was from Germany, and he introduced the first Christmas tree.